On the 9th of January, the Ukrainian parliament recognized the Circassian genocide. This week, we speak to one of the co-authors of the resolution, Ukrainian MP Oleksiy Goncharenko, about the significance of the move, and to OC Media's Yusuf Barduka, himself a descendant of survivors of the genocide, about what it means for the Circassian community worldwide. I'm Robin Fabro, and you're listening to the Caucasus Digest. Joining us now is OC Media editor and Caucasus Digest producer, Yusuf Barduka. Welcome to the show, Yusuf.
Thanks, Robin. Happy to be here today.
So, Yusuf, why don't you just give us a very quick rundown of what we're talking about today, of the Circassian genocide?
Right, so the Circassian genocide, that took place in the 19th century. We had this huge war with Russia. Basically, all of the Caucasus was involved, and it was sort of divided into Eastern and Western theaters. In the East, you had the Chechens, and you had Imam Shamil. And in the West, you had the various Circassian tribes.
Who were kind of resisting Russian conquest, right?
Yeah, essentially. So the whole Caucasian War essentially started in Eastern Circassia when the Kabardians were like, okay, can you stop building forts in our lands? And Russia didn't really take that very well. And we basically ended up with a pretty massive conflict across the North Caucasus, and that lasted for almost a century. So once Russia subdued the Northeast Caucasus, they basically focused their whole attention onto the Circassians, and they specifically really wanted the Black Sea coast. At some point, they sort of realized that the Circassians were putting up too much resistance, and that's when the Tsarist authorities just decided to ethnically cleanse the region. Plenty of people died, either as a direct result of Russia's assault on the Circassians, or indirectly as they were basically hoarded onto ships in huge numbers and just taken all across the Ottoman Empire's ports.
And I mean, okay, Russia does not accept this term genocide, but there is a scholarly consensus, and if you look at kind of what was happening, you know, this burning villages, just massacring hundreds, thousands of men, women, and children, right? There's little doubt that this was genocide.
I feel like in any case, when you're describing something as a genocide, someone will pop up and argue against that. But I mean, yeah, essentially 90% of all the Circassians were either killed or deported. We're talking about figures from the 1860s. We didn't actually have great media outlets like OC Media covering these things, right? It's, I guess, borderline impossible to fact check all of these, but we can always look into Ottoman records or Imperial Russian records, which shows that a lot of Circassians were expelled from Russia, and a lot of them made it into the Ottoman Empire.
And I mean, you yourself are also a testament to this, right?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Jordan. There's a relatively sizable Circassian community there. Some say it's around 200,000 or 300,000 of us there. They've been there since maybe the 1880s, less than 20 years after the Caucasian War ended. They were settled there by the Ottoman Empire. My family was originally settled in Syria. My grandfather just ended up moving back and forth between Jordan and Syria. Most Circassians actually live in Turkey nowadays. Some put them anywhere between 3 to 5 million.
Much more than in historic Circassia.
Yeah, for sure. So historic Circassia is basically divided into 3 autonomous republics within Russia. You have Kabarda-Balkaria, you have Karachay-Cherkessia, and you have Adige. Kabarda-Balkaria and Karachay-Cherkessia are basically shared between Circassians and the Karachays and Balkars. Karachays and Balkars are very closely related to each other. And one thing of note here is that the Russian authorities, ever since they took over the Northwest Caucasus, they have have actually put in a lot of effort in sort of differentiating administratively and linguistically and culturally between the Circassian people, even though they're essentially the same sort of thing. In the east, you have the people they call the Kabardins, who live in Kabarda-Balkaria, and you have the Cherkess, who live in Karachay-Cherkessia, and then you have the Adige, who basically live in Adige, and you also have the Shapsugh on the coast. But I feel like the only distinction between these people is essentially just east and west, this dialectical thing in linguistic terms, I guess, poor linguistic terms. So yeah, it was essentially a policy of divide and conquer. One more interesting thing to note here is that the Republic of Adige itself, where unfortunately the Circassians are a minority compared to other ethnic groups such as Russians, Adige is landlocked inside another Russian region, Krasnodar Krai, the vast majority of which was heavily populated by Circassian tribes who were expelled from the Caucasus after the war as a result of the genocide. So we're talking about a really radical population shift that took place here in the late 19th century.
So why we're talking about this today is that Ukraine has just recognized the genocide, the second country in the world to do so. How has the Circassian community reacted to this recognition?
I would say it was a bit mixed, but it was fairly disappointing where it actually matters. So you see in the diaspora, most Circassians are essentially represented by Khassas. This is what we call them. The general English term we use to describe them is associations. Associations essentially represent us in our diaspora communities. In Jordan, we have several, but they are all part of the main Khassa, which is in West Amman. Their reaction was virtually non-existent, which didn't necessarily come as a surprise. There has a lot of people often cast doubt on where their allegiances lie. They don't really like to talk about the Circassian genocide at all. When they talk about the deportations of the Circassians, the language they use is often problematic. They would not use the term deportations. They would say immigration, as if they voluntarily decided to pack up their things and leave the Caucasus. I thought what was particularly really tragic was that the Ukrainian ambassador in Jordan actually put up a post hours after the Verkhovna Rada adopted this resolution recognizing the Circassian genocide, and she expressed solidarity with the Circassian people, addressing them, addressing the Circassians of Jordan in her post. And you know what? If I were the head of a Circassian association, I feel like I would be obliged to respond to that, right? Otherwise, I've seen some people point out that, hey, you know what? Ukraine is only doing this in order to spite Russia because, you know, Ukraine is currently being invaded by Russia.
So why do you think there has been this lack of reaction from these kind of organized diaspora groups?
See, that's a bit of a complicated question, right? So if you look at the associations in Jordan and let's say Syria, as far as we all understand, they don't really depend financially on Russia. I recently had this conversation with someone who explained to me how diverse the income of the Jordanian association is, for example. But, you know, I feel like we sort of do live in a time where it is absolutely okay to take a step away from Russia and its policies. And I don't necessarily feel like the diaspora communities in the Middle East are taking that chance.
And are ordinary Circassians frustrated by this? Or, I mean, how do they feel about this kind of things, the recognition internationally of the genocide?
Again, a bit of a complicated question, I guess, but it could also be a bit of a sensitive topic. I mean, if we go back to 2011, when Georgia became the first country to recognize the Circassian genocide, some Circassians, and maybe more than some Circassians, didn't take that particularly well because in the conflict in Abkhazia, many Circassians supported Abkhazia, and they feel like Abkhazia has also offered them support in return. And again, like with Ukraine, a lot of people sort of viewed Georgia's recognition of the Circassian genocide as a tool Tbilisi was using to get back at Russia and Abkhazia. I mean, that it's only natural that most Circassians do want the world to recognize the tragedy that happened to their ancestors, right?
And maybe even to be able to return one day.
And of course, maybe even to return one day. And that's also one nice thing about the resolution that Ukraine adopted. It stipulates that the Ukrainian parliament recognizes the Circassians' right to self-determination and their right to return to their homeland. And that's a good thing. That's the kind of rhetoric that Circassians should be aiming for. I believe that it is time for them to be just a bit more pragmatic. You could argue that they are being used as a political tool, but at the same time, you can get something out of this, right?
And do you think it could lead to more recognition internationally?
I certainly hope so. Based on my understanding of how Ukraine recognized the genocide, it was essentially based on the efforts of a few Circassian groups who were based in Russia prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but eventually left and began operating in exile. It was them who managed to get that resolution registered at the Ukrainian parliament 2 years ago or 1 year ago. But as great as their efforts have been in getting Ukraine to recognize the Circassian genocide, more needs to be done. Otherwise, we're going to have to wait yet another decade for another country to recognize the genocide.
Yusuf, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Robin.
Oleksiy Goncharenko is a Ukrainian MP from the European Solidarity Party who co-authored the resolution recognizing the Circassian genocide. Mr. Goncharenko, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Could you first of all walk us through how this law came about?
I was wondering how we can support Circassians in their fight for freedom. And also I am head of interfractional group caucus in Ukrainian parliament for Free Caucasus. I am an author of the bill on recognition of independence of Ichkeria, Chechnya, and other things. So 2.5 years ago, I also sponsored to Ukrainian parliament bill about recognition of genocide of Circassians during the Russian Caucasus War. It took more than 2 years, but finally, slightly different text was registered, where I am co-author, which was finally adopted by Ukrainian parliament. And I hope that this will be a symbol and sign of support from Ukraine to Circassian people in their will for independence, and also that will be a recognition of history, naming the spades, because that was a real genocide and it should be acknowledged.
And you and many others in Ukraine have taken this strong interest in the North Caucasus. You mentioned there some of your other work. Why is that so important to Ukraine to support the North Caucasus specifically?
It is really important because we Ukrainians, we suffer today from genocide from Russians, and for the second time during last 100 years. And we feel very passionate, and we have a lot of empathy to other nations who are coming through something similar. So that is one reason. Second reason is that we are fighting against Russian Empire. And Russian Empire is using all these colonized nations as a cannon fodder against Ukraine. So quicker this empire will fall apart, that is super important for national security of Ukraine. So we have all reasons to do this job, and I think this job is very important.
So this latest resolution, it instructs the Ukrainian government to promote awareness of the Circassian genocide. What kind of steps do you expect the government to take in this regard?
This resolution, we are the second parliament in the world who acknowledged this genocide. The first was Georgian parliament. And first of all, it's a symbolic act and political act. The Ukrainian government should, in its cooperation with the world, also communicate the need of recognition of genocide of Circassian people. And I think if more countries will join this initiative, that will be very important.
So you mentioned some of these other initiatives about the North Caucasus, the recognition of Chechnya's right to become an independent state, the right of the Ingush people to self-determination. Why do you think this recognition of the Circassian genocide kind of took longer than those two?
It's really difficult to say, but also a lot of depends from the nations themselves. I mean, Chechens were fighting. Everybody knows in Ukraine about Chechen. People fight about Chechen wars. Everybody knows it. Circassian, on contrary, is a very different story. Not many people in Ukraine realize the history of Circassian people, how similar it is to our own history. And that's why it took much more time to understand the importance of this. Also, we understand that there is a lot of Chechens in Ukraine, and they fought in the army. There is a special voluntary battalions which are fighting together with Ukrainian army against Russian invasion. And it's not the case about Circassians. There is not many Circassians. There is very, very, very small number of Circassians in Ukraine. So it's much less known story and much less developed relationships.
And I mean, some Ukrainians in the past have advocated for a Cuban People's Republic, which they say would cover much of what Circassians consider historic Circassia. Now, I know some Circassians have seen this as a kind of claim to their historic homeland. Do you think there is any tension there in Ukraine between these ideas of supporting Circassia and this idea of a Cuban People's Republic?
I don't see any tension. That's history. These lands were populated by Circassians, but after this, they were hugely populated by Ukrainians. Kubani, 100 years ago, was mostly Ukrainian speaking, and even now, there is a lot of Ukrainian culture there. Still, Ukrainian language is present. So there are a lot of ties between Ukraine and this region, but Ukraine never claimed these territories to be part of Ukraine. That's more about history, culture, and we have a lot of respect to Ukrainians there. Unfortunately, mostly they are now Russified, but still there is, and we hope that one day there will be revival and renaissance of Ukrainian culture in this region. But again, for Ukraine, it's a question of communication kind of with our diaspora, but it's not a territorial claim.
And do you foresee any further resolutions or actions regarding the North Caucasus from Ukraine in the near future?
For the moment, there is nothing under consideration in the parliament. It can be, maybe, but no concrete plans for the moment.
Finally, I'd like to take a bit of a different track with you and ask you a little bit about Georgia. You were an observer in Georgia's recent parliamentary elections, and maybe you could share with us a little bit about that experience and how that was for you.
Definitely, that Georgia is very important. And for me personally, for Ukraine, as an international observer, I was clear about what I saw. I said from the beginning that I can't call these elections free and fair. These elections were not fraud, but they were stolen. We can even say maybe not stolen. These elections were bought by a Georgian Dream and Ivanishvili. And I saw this by my own eyes during the observation mission. And unfortunately, I was right. And now we see that European Parliament, other bodies realize what's happening in Georgia now. And I think this is a Belarus scenario, Belarusization of Georgia, where pro-Russian puppets are taking control over Georgia and stopping its European integration, which is a huge threat to the whole region and a huge problem for future of Georgian people. So, yeah, it's very painful to see what's happening in Georgia now, but I believe that Georgian people can stop this catastrophic scenario.
And I mean, we hear Georgian officials frequently attacking Ukraine and the Ukrainian government. I mean, is that hard to hear from a country that I think is historically been seen as a friend of Ukraine?
Yeah, it is painful, but we clearly distinguish between Georgian people and current Georgian regime. So for us, we know that we have a lot of support from Georgian people. There is a lot of volunteers who are fighting for Ukraine, Georgian volunteers who came to Ukraine to fight for our country. against Russian aggression, and so on. So we understand that Georgian people support us, and we understand the Georgian regime is not equal to Georgian people.
Mr. Goncharenko, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
That's it for this week's episode. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to support our work, please consider becoming an OC Media member. Membership includes a host of benefits, including newsletters, audio versions of articles, and more. Sign up at oc-media.org/membership. This week's show was presented by me, Robin Fabro. Producing and editing was by Yusuf Bardoka. The theme music was by Ben Wheeler.